Start tonight, and then I'm going to hand over to Peter about slightly less than halfway through. I'll start with some background. 60 years ago, in September 1963, one of the most iconic mosaics from Roman Britain was discovered behind the blacksmith's forge in the small village of Hinton St Mary in Dorset. The blacksmith, Mr. White, wanted to build an extension at the back of the forge and had asked his workers to dig a hole for the foundation. In another version, he simply wanted to set up a new washing line. It doesn't really matter how it happened, because the point is that digging down about 18 inches, they struck something solid. Mr. White peered into the hole and saw what was quite obviously neatly arranged tesserae, and he realised he had a mosaic. White had apparently been in North Africa during the war and had seen Roman mosaics there. He and his workers expanded the hole a little and exposed the parts of the mosaic in the two parts of the bipartite room, which I'll come on to. Next on the scene is Pat Moody, a local school teacher who was fetched from nearby Sturminster Newton. With the additional advice of Roger Pears and Rodney Dewar from Dorset County Museum, Mr. Moody and a number of... okay. Is that a bit better? Is that a bit better? That better? Yeah, okay, all right. Mr. Moody and a number of pupils from his school came along to help expose the mosaic. Every single one of them went on to have long, lucrative and successful careers. In other words, none of them became archaeologists. These rather quaint images are courtesy of Pat Moody, who is still alive and well, living in Stir, as they call it, Sturminster Newton. And they show all this work in progress and the fact that the weather seems to have been fortuitously rather glorious at the time. We'll also want to draw your attention to this chap here. There, yeah, you probably know who that is. That is, of course, David Neal, who went down to do one of his illustrations of the mosaic. At the time, he worked for the Ministry of Works, which later became English Heritage. I think David's in his early 20s here. And still going strong, as you shall see later. So this is what the mosaic looked like when it had all been exposed. And this is David Neal's watercolour of the mosaic. Sorry, that's not the sharpest image in the world, but it will do. The mosaic at Hinton was purchased by the British Museum from Mr. White, lifted in 1965 and became part of the National Collection. As I'm sure most of you know, the lifting of mosaics is rather controversial, and most specialists now would advocate exposure, recording, and then reburial. Well, I think this was probably a major factor, was that the BM was redoing its British galleries at the time and saw an opportunity. Its eventual home was at the top of the main stairs. And here's a quite nice image of the work in progress of it being laid at the top of the main stairs of the BM. I'll talk a bit at the end about what happened in later years. As David Neal's watercolour shows, the mosaic at Hinton is a large floor. It measured about 8 metres by 5 metres, that is divided into two parts. A larger, more or less square section and a smaller rectangular area divided by a wall and a threshold. The point being that it is one large rectangular room divided into two spaces, or a bipartite room to be exact. Now, of course, the most well-known part of the mosaic is the so-called Christ roundel, and very soon after discovery, this is really where all the tension started to turn. Many scholars, and the debate is ongoing, believe it is one of the earliest representations of Christ, dating to the 4th century AD. The argument is based on the very simple fact that there is a Chi Rho symbol behind the man's head, and pomegranates on either side, symbols of eternal life. However, there are a number of uncertainties, particularly relating to the imperial family at this time. Constantine the Great was declared emperor at York on the death of his father, Constantius, in AD 305. They had been on campaign in the north of Britain, and Constantine was already in his 30s at this point. He didn't become sole emperor until AD 312. The crucial thing here is that in order to become this, he had to defeat his rival Maxentius, and before the eve of battle, he's said to have dreamt of the Chi-Rho symbol and been told that in this sign you will be victorious, and indeed he was. The point being that Constantine actively embraced Christianity after this point, and the Chi-Rho symbol became synonymous with victory. So we have to accept the possibility that the portrait may represent Constantine the Great, who visited the province a number of times after he became emperor. The similarity in the style of the Hinton bust with that of these surviving busts in marble and in bronze is very, very clear. The eyes, the hair, the distinctive cleft chin. So might the image instead be better identified with the imperial cult? Might the mosaic and the buildings at the site even suggest a direct connection with Constantine himself? But the image could also represent a successor of Constantine, such as Magnentius. This has been suggested by Sam Moorhead, who used the Chi-Rho symbol on his coins and also had a distinctive double chin. The other uncertainties surround the imagery, surround the imagery that we see in the rest of the mosaic. In each corner of the main room is another male figure. All are flanked by rosettes or pomegranates and also have this rather odd-looking withered arm underneath their palliums. Can we say that? And again, their identity is not certain. Some have suggested the four winds, but then why an attempt to make that a bit more clear? If the central figure is Christ, might they be the evangelists? That's been another suggestion. Or if it's a Christianized emperor, might they be his sons? Constantine, after all, happened to have 4 sons, so they could represent his sons. The other fairly obvious point is that none of the rest of the imagery is particularly Christian. The lunettes are filled with hunting scenes, such as dogs chasing stags. The subject matter from the other smaller room is very much drawn from the classical tradition. It depicts the hero Bellerophon riding Pegasus and in the act of thrusting a spear into the Chimera. Now, the Christian argument for the use of this scene is that in simple terms, it represents the triumph of good over evil. In more complex allegorical readings, we might point to the fact that Christ and Bellerophon both ascended to heaven, although Bellerophon was unsuccessful in his attempt to join the gods. If we wish to continue this line of thought, then we can say that Bellerophon was not holy, not divine enough, so was unable to join the gods whilst Christ was. Was this a reminder of the mortality of man over the divinity of Christ? But again, we can readily identify the scene with the Emperor Constantine or his immediate successors. Another image that occurs regularly is the emperor on horseback trampling a fallen enemy, such as on this bronze medallion of Constantine. So it's easy to see how the Bellerophon story would have appealed as an allegory of the emperor defeating his enemies, as much as having any Christian connotations. We have in this room, in the smaller room, further hunt scenes of dogs and stags. To my mind, this places the mosaic firmly within the world of an aristocratic owner. Hunting was, as is still today, a luxury leisure time activity enjoyed by the wealthy who can afford the expense of maintaining stables of horses and the sizable land holdings needed for the hunt itself. But to take this further, we obviously have to understand more about the wider context of the mosaic, asking the very simple question, what was the mosaic doing there? So in 1964, Kenneth Painter, a British Museum curator and the man behind the acquisition of the mosaic at the BM, returned to Hinton to conduct further excavations at the site. I suspect that Kenneth had got the bug and was rather hoping there would be other mosaics to add to the BM collection. But perhaps being a bit more charitable, he also realised he needed to know more in order to have something to say in the new BM displays. Painter hoped to try to find the rest of the villa because he believed that the mosaic was part of a villa complex. He focused his attention on the area to the south of the mosaic, basically down here, where the current owner of the site has paddocks for her horses. Painter did keyhole archaeology, opening up a small number of trenches and finding some traces of wall. A subsequent letter to the art historian Jocelyn Toynbee, written in May 1964, Painter tells her that they failed to find any more fine pavements, again perhaps a hint at his disappointment, only a badly preserved one with a geometric pattern. He believed that the house has at least 2 wings and possibly a third. He concluded that the house was demolished at the end of the Roman period as there was, quote, no trace of medieval occupation. Painter expanded on his findings in a later unpublished report. The main buildings of the villa apparently surround 3 sides of a rectangle, the 4th side being enclosed by a ditch. The Christian mosaic formed part of the best preserved wing, which ran along the northeast side of the site. The buildings along the northwest and southeast sides had been very severely robbed, the building material having been removed down to the bottom of the foundation trenches. So what Painter had in mind was something like this, a typical 4th century courtyard villa, some buildings perhaps having two or more levels, perhaps a bathhouse, reception rooms, an area where you could stable animals, and a nice garden where you could grow vegetables and have orchards perhaps, and perhaps a wall running around. So that's kind of what Painter had in mind. And you would imagine something like this as a room inside with those mosaics and furniture, painted walls. Window grills is appropriate because an iron window grill was found there and is also in the BM. But none of this was ever really convincing. Basically, that's where our understanding of the site sat until very recently. Now, briefly before I hand over to Peter to talk about our Fieldwork project, I wanted to talk about Hinton in relation to other mosaics and sites in the Dorset region. This slightly blurry map, apologies for that, shows where villas have been discovered in the county. As you can see, a number of villas lie on the Roman road that ran from Dorchester to Ilchester. There's also a cluster of villas around Vindo Claudia, basically Badbury Rings. However, although the quality of the mosaics found at sites in Dorset suggests that some of the villas in the area were very grand, with a few notable exceptions, for example, Dewlish, the plans of these villas are at best partially known. However, in general, the pattern seems to be a number of detached buildings grouped around a central courtyard, garden, but linked by a porticus. They're not a million miles away to what Kenneth had in mind. 2 other sites with strong links with Hinton are circled: Frampton and Fyford Neville. So Frampton is the only other mosaic in Britain to feature a Chi-Rho symbol. Sorry, going back slightly. The villa at Frampton was discovered in 1794 and exposed by the antiquarian Samuel Lysons a few years later. Lysons made meticulous drawings of the mosaics and a plan of the building shown here. What you'll note is a bipartite room here. Another room with mosaics and a long linking porticus. The relationship with another mosaic in a rectangular room and another linking corridor or porticus is a bit unclear. So that's obviously what's going on down here. But I think that you'll see clearly is the strong parallel between Frampton and Hinton, particularly the use of a bypass-type room. The other similarity between Frampton and Hinton is that Frampton's the only other mosaic in Britain to feature a Chi-Rho symbol, which you can see here. Although this is much smaller, and like Hinton, one of the roundels has a scene of the Bellerophon slaying the Chimera. In fact, the style of the mosaic is similar enough to suggest that the same mosaicists were involved in both mosaics. But the crucial difference between the mosaics is the apse. This suggests that it is highly likely that this was a dining room with the typical arrangement of couches of the late Roman period, i.e. a stabadium rather than a triclinium arrangement. There is no evidence that Hinton was part of a dining room. The villa at Fifield Neville, discovered in 1880 and excavated then and subsequently in 1902, provides further parallels, including another bipartite room up here. One of the rooms contained lunettes, similar to those at Hinton, and a circular roundel in the centre. This apparently contained a bust of a man, but it is only known from a painting of the mosaic, as the mosaic itself has not survived. Some have suggested this might also be a Christ portrait, with these lines perhaps some part of a Chi-Rho symbol, but it's not very convincing. And I think, to be honest, it's more likely to be Bacchus, and that's probably a Thyrsus. Nevertheless, the style of the mosaic is enough to suggest that it may have been done by the same mosaicists responsible for the Hinton and also Frampton so-called Dunavarium group, because it's postulated that this group of mosaicists was based at Dorchester. Okay, just finishing up before I hand over. So just to bring us bang up to date, in 2012, Dorset Museum approached the BM with a view to borrowing the Hinton mosaic for display in their refurbished museum. I'll talk about this a little more at the end, but this was the main reason why we decided to put together a new fieldwork project at Hinton, since any redisplay would require much better contextual information than we currently have. And so at this point, I'm going to pass over to Peter to talk about the fieldwork project.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm not too loud, am I? At the back? No, is that okay? Good. Yes, so thank you very much. After that introduction, we went to Hinton St Mary in order to provide more archaeological and historical context for the mosaic prior to its move from London to Dorset. Before we went, I'll describe 3 seasons that we undertook in 2021, 2 and 3. But some 15, 20 years before that, English Heritage, as was then, Historic England as is now, undertook a series of geophysical surveys of the scheduled area at Hinton St Mary, the results of which you can see in front of you, resistivity on the left-hand side and magnetometry on the right-hand side. These indicated, if you look at the top left image, that the scheduled area appears to be full of archaeological features, long, narrow anomalies, which are in white or in black, which you can see on there, which gave some indication that perhaps if these are all Roman, or if these were all Roman, then perhaps the situation wasn't quite as simple as Kenneth Painter and others since then had thought, in terms of the site being interpreted as a courtyard villa. There appears to be, for example, in the area of the courtyard, which is in here, a whole series of anomalies that could have been buildings, which I'll come back to in a little while. So in 2021, we applied for scheduled monument consent, which was granted in order to undertake what's known as an evaluation season, so more keyhole excavation, and we uncovered 6 evaluation trenches that you can see in front of you across the area of the scheduled monument behind the forge in Hinton St Mary. The objectives of these evaluation trenches were to identify how far below the modern ground surface any archaeology might survive, the condition of the archaeological remains survival, and also any indication whether there could be pre-Roman, Roman, and post-Roman occupation on the site. This evaluation season gave us a very good indication of what was going on, and in all 6 trenches we were able to demonstrate that there was no post-Roman archaeology in any of the trenches as far as we could tell, so no Anglo-Saxon and no medieval, unless we were very close to the modern house, and that the archaeological remains in each of those evaluation trenches were exclusively of Roman date. On the left-hand side, you can see a series of surfaces and the remains of a Roman wall, and on the right-hand side in Trench 3, we're in the area of the courtyard, the so-called courtyard, where we revealed very robust, hard-standing surfaces and a number of ditch features, which I'll come back to in a little while. But the combination of the geophysics from 96 and also the results of our 21 evaluation excavations meant that we were able to go back to Historic England and propose a 2-year campaign of research excavations, more targeted on answering very specific questions with the knowledge that these had provided. We also undertook, in association with, I can see Chris Lockyer pulling a face, and I don't blame him, we also undertook with various university partners, Reading on the left-hand side, Winchester on the right, a number of new geophysical surveys, particularly GPR, which we were hoping was going to answer all the questions that we had without requiring any excavation. The Reading survey on the top left produced a very grainy black and white image, which effectively shows that some of the features that were already known can be seen using ground-penetrating radar. The Winchester survey, the bottom right, is not yet complete, and you need a certain kind of glasses to be able to look at that without getting a bit freaked out by the reds and the pinks and the greens. GPR was not the answer to the questions that we were hoping it was going to be, but Historic England persisted and came back again earlier this year to carry out a much more extensive ground-penetrating radar survey. This is the field, the scheduled field. They also carried out surveys in 2 adjacent fields too, with effectively the same results that Reading and Winchester generated, which is not very much. So it required, essentially, to answer the questions that we'd set ourselves, it required the opening of a number of trenches, and over 2 seasons, we opened 6 trenches altogether based on the geophysical knowledge that we had from 20-odd years ago, and also, of course, the results of the evaluation trench from 2021. This is the 2022 season. The mosaic that we've been talking about, that Richard showed us, was discovered here. This is now a horse paddock. We opened 1 trench inside the cowshed and 2 others near it, and I'll show you a couple of those results. Next to the mosaic, as you can see on the right-hand side, the red shape gives you an idea where the trench is. This is Trench 3. And we demonstrated that attached to the mosaic room was indeed a very large wall, as Ken Painter had discovered. But unlike Ken Painter's interpretation, this quite clearly wasn't an external or internal wall for a building. It appears to have been a boundary wall of some kind that separated out 2 open areas. The one on the south was quite clearly heavily surfaced with good, let me see if I can use this, with large stones, and we have a drain in the northern part as well. So this gave us the first indication that perhaps the plan that Painter had suggested might need reconsidering. To the south of the mosaic room, we also discovered the same mosaic that Ken Painter had found in 1964 and that David Neal had drawn, which you can see in room 1. It was indeed damaged by medieval ploughing, and it did indeed have a geometric black and white border going around it. But by opening up more of the room, we were able to see that the central part of that mosaic had been, once upon a time, probably of a similar quality to the mosaic that we were looking at earlier on. This trench produced a large number of very small, very fine tesserae, suggesting that in the middle of this room, where room 1 actually is on this slide, there would have been a central panel that showed perhaps a figurative scene or something like that, but unfortunately, as I said, that has been completely removed and we have no way of reconstructing it. The importance of this trench, however, was that it showed that the building that we'd identified and the painter knew existed was not connected to the mosaic room physically. And there was about an 8-meter gap between the northern part of this building that we're looking at on the slide and the room with the mosaic. So rather than it being a wing attached to a corridor villa, we're looking at a separate building, possibly in a separate part of the complex, if that's what the boundary wall was actually showing. Richard showed David Neal as a young man. This slide shows David Neal as an ever young man, to be honest with you. He came down and helped us to photograph and draw the second mosaic. So it was great to see him 59 years later on exactly the same site and to hear his stories of coming down from London on a Friday afternoon with his drawing equipment in order to record the famous mosaic. At a different lecture, I said that this comes from him, I said that he hopped on his Vespa and drove down from London, from central London to North Dorset, and he corrected me later because it was a Lambretta, so I'm glad that I was able to get that right. He would never have ridden a Vespa, he said. So that was Trench 2. Earlier on this year, less than 3 months ago, we were also on site to carry out our third and final research excavation. And here you can see trenches 4, 5, and 6 being opened. Trench 4, on the right-hand side of the slide, wrapped around the mosaic and the room where the mosaic had been in order to perhaps explore if other sides of the mosaic had been connected to internal spaces along the lines of Frampton perhaps or other villas. And what we found was that the boundary wall is just to the south of Trench 4. Here we can see the external eastern wall of the mosaic room, which turned to create the northern narrower side. So the mosaic is in here. And we demonstrated this year that actually to the east of the mosaic room was an open space, possibly not even paved, maybe a garden of some kind. So we're looking at the rear wall here, or the outside wall, but that the mosaic room, rather than being connected to a building which went in this direction, so east-west, was connected to another building that extended to the north, north-south, and allows us now to begin to understand how perhaps the building with the mosaic might have been orientated or aligned rather than it looking southwards across the Blackmore Vale and the River Stour. Instead, it would have looked northwestwards towards the village of Marnell along the Roman road, which gives us a completely different impression of what this building was doing and how it might have been situated, and therefore the purpose of the mosaic within it. Further to the south, we opened another trench. This is trench 6, in order to find the other end of the narrow building with the second robbed out mosaic. What we found were the remains of a building, but not the same building with the mosaic. So on a slightly different alignment and using completely different construction techniques, what we're looking at here is another building that extended away from the mosaic on a very similar alignment to the first one, but with a possibly different function. And you can see from the slide the walls. This is the eastern external wall, and that's the western external wall. This wall here divides the inside of our third building into two different spaces, two different rooms. And here, right in the very corner of one, we have the flue of a feature of some kind that could have been a kiln or an oven or something along those lines. We're hoping that the environmental samples that we took from the inside of the flue will tell us if we're looking at something that was to do with woodworking, metalworking, or to do with agriculture, or to do with more domestic functions such as cooking. We opened our 6th and final trench. This is trench 5, slap bang in the middle of this open courtyard area that might not have been an open courtyard area at all. And what we discovered was an area that does appear to have been open, but which had a series of subterranean features within it that the Historic England 96 geophysics had picked up. And if you imagine that the slide of the picture, the image of the trench on the left-hand side, you need to turn it around in your mind by about 90 degrees. The long linear anomalies on the geophysics are here, and here, and here, and here. And that whereas the geophysicists had interpreted those as the remains of buildings because they could see internal walls or partitions. And we have those here, and we also have those here. But what the excavation showed is that these weren't walls, these were stone-capped drains of some kind, four of them running parallel to one another with what looked like tributaries or connections, shorter connecting drains that link them together, which on the geophysics looked like the internal walls. All of these drains were constructed in the same way, so ditches were cut and then stones were laid inside, presumably or possibly for wooden pipes of some kind, which were then sealed with these very large slabs that you can see in front, which were then themselves sealed by the latest surfaces of this open courtyard. We can see from the geophysics that these drains don't appear to have extended very far. They went for perhaps about 100 meters or so down the field. This is one of the other drains too, which does appear to have the base of a wall sitting on top of it. We're struggling at the moment to understand what we have here. David Neal was very kind to come down and have a look at them, have a look at these features, and in some ways I'm pleased to say that he didn't have a clue either. And so we will be looking around at other villa excavations in Britain and elsewhere to try and get a better understanding of what we can see. But what was quite clear from our conversation was that for a very long time, archaeologists like David and Richard and myself and others in this room and elsewhere, if we excavate Roman villas, we tend to concentrate on the buildings, on the domestic buildings or the ancillary buildings perhaps, not necessarily always looking for tessellated pavements, but what we don't really do is look beyond those buildings into the central areas of these complexes or even very far beyond them. And maybe what we need to be doing in the future is perhaps doing a little bit more of that every once in a while. This is a new resistivity survey that Historic England undertook earlier this year too, at the same time as the ground penetrating radar survey. The trench I've just been describing was here, and these are the remains, or these are the anomalies that clearly represent the ditches or the drains that we saw earlier. They appear to start here, so nowhere near the mosaic, and they don't seem to go much further than here. So they don't, as far as we can tell, reach a destination point, which might have been perhaps a bathhouse or something like that. And even if they did, I'm struggling to understand why you would need 4 parallel drains to do exactly the same thing. The amount of time and effort that constructing these took must have been considerable. And at the moment, as I said, it's still very difficult to imagine what was going on. And I wonder if we might need to sort of think outside the box a little bit more, maybe think about something to do with irrigation perhaps, or who knows what else. And if anybody in this room knows the answer, then there's a prize later on for the correct one, whenever that might be. So over 3 seasons, we have changed the story of Roman Hinton St Mary. If there was a villa building that looked something like this, it was oriented at 90 degrees to the plan as we've understood it for the last 60 years. That tells us something about the relationship between the villa itself and the surrounding landscape, and it also gives us a much better impression of Hinton St Mary more widely in the Roman period, because rather than this being Hinton St Mary, we're now getting a very strong impression that actually we're on the edge of a larger settlement that would have been on top of the hill at Hinton, which is where the modern church, which is where the medieval church is, and also the medieval abbey and the modern manor house. We don't, however, know exactly how the mosaic room would have functioned, how people would have used it, because we're still it's still unclear to us actually which room within a wider building it would have decorated. Was it more like the Frampton mosaic, the Frampton situation, where it's at the end of a long corridor? If so, then the Hinton antechamber doesn't appear to have been the way in. The Hinton antechamber seems to have been the focal point of the room itself, giving us a slightly different impression perhaps of how this building might have worked. What we are able to say is that before 300, there's no evidence for any occupation at Hinton at all, pre-300. The coins and the pottery, limited as they are, suggest that occupation there, or the buildings, were erected no earlier than 330, perhaps even slightly later, and that occupation, or the buildings, were no longer in use. They were derelict and were already falling down by 400, 420, which is also supported by the first three carbon dates that we had, that we sent off for dating in 2022, which suggest very strongly that there was no occupation at all at Hinton St Mary post 420 or 430, and that the buildings that we were excavating appear to have fallen down gradually over time rather than being torn down or burnt down as the result of a conflagration or some other Anglo-Saxon related event. Unfortunately, there are still, after 3 seasons, we know a lot more than we did 60 years ago, but we don't have all the answers to all the questions. We don't know the plan of the Roman buildings at Hinton St Mary. We don't really know how people would have used the rooms. We don't know what the buildings were used for. We have this idea that there were 2 separate parts of the complex divided by this boundary wall, perhaps one that was more domestic and one that was more agricultural or more rural in some way. And there are other questions about the use of the mosaic and actually what the mosaic was for that also are still unanswered. But this was a research, training and engagement project, and I'd like to finish off my part by showing you some pictures of what we did outside the trenches or in association with the trenches. We had a link with a number of schools in the local area, including Sturminster High School. The slide that Richard showed at the beginning of the presentation with the school kids on from 60 years ago, Richard and I have met many of those children who are no longer children. They're in their 70s and 80s now, but we were very pleased to invite 4 classes of Sturminster High School kids to come and look around the excavation too and tell them about what their predecessors had done 60 years before that. We also had a good partnership with Ustock School, also in Sturminster Newton, and these are some pictures of children from Ustock joining us on the excavation. Now, Ustock is a school for special needs children with mild disabilities all the way through to some very advanced and profound mental and physical disabilities. And we arranged a number of activities for the children to do with us. They spent afternoons with us. And I don't know if you've ever tried herding cats, but you want to try herding children that go to a special needs school, because it was very difficult and it was very challenging. But it was enormously rewarding to see the kids working with us, with our students. That's Grace on the top left, Ben top right, Rory bottom right, and Archie on the bottom left, working with us. They were digging, they were sieving, they were cleaning pottery, and they were metal detecting too. We told them about how important this archaeological site on their doorsteps is to the study of Roman Britain. We told them how to excavate and what archaeologists do, and hopefully tried to inspire them to become interested in archaeology and history in the future, if not archaeologists. This is the element of our project that the Royal Archaeological Institute supported this year, and your support went towards paying these two young ladies to help me with the Ustock School and Sturminster school visits. That's Tierney Tudor on the left and Elizabeth Guest on the right. And at the end of each visit, we asked the kids to stick a little sticker on a picture of the mosaic. The closer to the man's nose, the better they liked it. The further away, the more they hated it. And I hope, as you can see, 95% of them stuck their stickers on the middle of the man, whether it's Christ or Magnentius or Constantine's largely irrelevant. It shows they absolutely loved it. 3 of them thought it was a bit sacrilegious to put a green sticker anywhere near the man, which is why they're over on the right-hand side. So many thanks to the RAI for supporting the excavation and for helping these 2 young archaeologists get their foothold on a dig. It was this is my last slide, it was a training excavation too, and most of the digging team were students from Cardiff University and volunteers, many of whom were also Cardiff University graduates and postgraduates. They were trained by professional archaeologists from Albion Archaeology based in Bedford, so this was a really good and rewarding collaboration between the British Museum and the independent and commercial sectors, delivering what I hope you will agree, ticked all of the boxes as a research, training and engagement project, and it's not done. It never is done. So I'd better hand over to Richard, who will finish off and tell us, and me, what the next steps in our project are going to be.
Okay. I won't keep you too much longer. I'm sure there are questions to be asked. So next steps, well, we've got to write the site up. In some ways, it's a good thing. There hasn't been vast amounts of material generated. The site was surprisingly light of the usual things you have from sites, obviously ceramics, animal bone, CBM, coins, etc. So that gives us less work to do. But no, we've obviously got to fulfill the requirements of what Historic England expects of us. So we have to do the things that they ask in terms of reporting. But we're going to obviously, the eventual result will be a publication of the excavations in either a journal or a freestanding monograph. We haven't quite got to the stage of working that out yet. Archiving of material and so on. But in terms of, if you want to read more, there is the main point is the Via Nova website, which has a lot of information about our work and the excavations over the last 3 years. I wanted to also talk about the mosaic, because I think it's important that we do. When you will recall my earlier image of the mosaic being laid at the top of the main stairs, and that happened in the 1960s, and basically the mosaic stayed there for 40 years. And then in the middle part of the 1990s, the Great Court project started, and there were concerns that the mosaic might become damaged by vibration from the building in the Great Court. So a decision was taken to lift the entire mosaic from its position on the top of the main stairs. And basically, it was decided that the roundel, the main part of the mosaic, should go on display in room 49, the Gallery Western Gallery Roman Britain, which happened when the gallery was refurbished in 1997, and that's basically where the roundel has stayed ever since. We were given certain reassurances that a home would be found for the entire mosaic after the Great Court project was completed. That never happened. And in 2012, we were approached by as I mentioned earlier, approached by Dorset Museum, who were hoping to display the mosaic as part of their new museum. That also has never happened. And so basically, we are now in a situation where the roundel will continue to be on display in the Western Gallery of Roman Britain, and the rest of the mosaic, sadly, will be going to storage in our new storage facility out in Reading, the so-called Reading Ark, the Archaeological Resource Centre, and that is going to be the situation for the foreseeable future until a longer-term solution can be found to the display of the mosaic. I wanted to talk about this because I think it's important people know where we are, because we get asked about it a lot. So, just to finish up, we have a lot of people to thank. Most of these are in absentia. Dr. Mike Watts is here. And we'd like to thank Mike and his wife for their support of the project over the years, which has been very, very important from a financial side point of view. We've really run the project on a relative shoestring in terms of archaeological work. As you all know, archaeology is not cheap. We also want to thank Katie Scorgie, who is the owner of the land. Obviously, we couldn't have done anything without Katie's agreement. She moved her horses for us, not least. And she was very, very supportive and helpful, as were particularly the various members of the Pitt Rivers estate, Mr. and Mrs. Pitt Rivers, Alice Fox Pitt in particular, and then these various other people. And as Peter said, the Royal Archaeological Institute, we'd like to thank you for your support, because that's allowed us to do a lot of the educational things that we wouldn't have been otherwise able to do. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. So thank you very much for listening.